Something unusual happened when the stable boy came to the ranch. CowBoy Secrets. Part 1. The Arrival. The first thing Eli Carter noticed about the new stable boy was not his face. It was the way he stood. Most hands who came through Redstone Ranch arrived with something to prove. They stepped off the bus or out of a truck with their chests puffed out, their boots already scuffed from some other ranch they'd been let go from, their eyes moving around like they were calculating how fast they could leave. They had that restless, temporary look that Eli had learned to recognize before they'd even said hello. He could usually tell within the first 10 minutes whether someone would make it through the summer or disappear after 2 weeks with $40 in unpaid wages and a half-eaten sandwich missing from the bunkhouse refrigerator. But Jesse Navarro stood in the middle of the gravel driveway on that bright Tuesday morning in early June, with one worn leather duffel bag sitting beside his boots, and he was completely, absolutely still. He was looking out past the fence line, past the water troughs and the rusted gate that led to the back pasture, and he was staring at the open land like it was something he had been searching for a very long time. His hands were loose at his sides. His shoulders were not tense. He was not performing anything. He was just standing there, breathing, like a man who had finally arrived somewhere that felt right. Eli watched him from the porch steps for almost a full minute before saying a word. He told himself he was finishing his coffee. That was true enough. But there was something about the way Jesse stood in that morning light, the sun catching the edge of his dark hair, the stillness of him against all that wide golden land, that made Eli slow down in a way he rarely allowed himself to do. He was always moving on this ranch, always fixing something or feeding something or worrying about something. Stillness was not something that came naturally to him, not anymore, not since his father had gotten sick 2 years ago, and the whole weight of Redstone had settled onto his shoulders like a yoke he hadn't asked for and couldn't put down. So when a stranger showed him what stillness looked like, Eli noticed. He set his coffee mug on the porch railing and walked down the steps. "You Jesse," he called out when he was close enough. The young man turned, and that was when Eli saw his face for the first time. He was not what Eli expected. He was lean but not slight, with brown skin that had clearly spent time in the sun before, dark eyes that were alert and quiet at the same time, and a mouth that looked like it was trying to decide whether to smile. He looked like someone who had been through something real and had come out the other side of it thoughtful rather than hard. He looked, Eli thought, like the kind of person who paid attention. "That's me," Jesse said. His voice was even, not nervous, not trying too hard, just steady. "Eli Carter." Eli extended his hand. "I run the operations here. My father owns the land." Jesse shook his hand firmly, and Eli noticed his grip, not crushing, not limp, just solid, present. "I've worked horses before," Jesse said. "Mostly quarter horses and some Appaloosas, but I can adapt. I learn fast." "I know," Eli said. "Your references checked out. Me Prescott over at Sundon said you were the best hand she'd had in 3 years. He paused. "She also said you quit without a lot of explanation." Jesse held his gaze without flinching. "I did." Eli waited a beat to see if more was coming. It wasn't. "All right," Eli said. He picked up the duffel bag before Jesse could reach for it, more out of habit than hospitality, and started walking toward the bunkhouse. "I'll show you where you're sleeping. Rules are simple. You work the morning feed at 5:30, you check the fencing rotation on Tuesdays and Thursdays, you report anything unusual directly to me. My father is not well, so you won't see him much. You need something, you come to me." Jesse walked beside him without rushing to fill the silence. Most new hands either talked too much or asked too many questions in those first minutes. Jesse did neither. He just kept pace with Eli's stride and looked around the ranch with that same quiet attentiveness he'd shown in the driveway, his eyes moving over the stables, the round pen, the old oak tree near the water trough, taking everything in without judgment. They reached the bunkhouse, a long, low building with green-painted shutters and a screen door that groaned on its hinge every single time it opened. Eli had been meaning to fix that hinge for 6 months. "2 other hands in here," Eli said, pushing the door open. "Carlos and Big Roy. They keep to themselves mostly, but they're good people. Bathrooms down the hall. You get the bunk on the left by the window." He set the duffel down at the foot of the bed. "Any questions?" Jesse looked around the room carefully, then turned to Eli. "Just one," he said. "Shoot." "What's the horse's name?" Jesse asked. "The gray one. I saw him in the first stall when I came up the drive. He was watching me." Eli blinked. In all his years of hiring hands, no one had ever made that their first question. "Ghost," Eli said quietly. "His name is Ghost." Something shifted in Jesse's expression. Not quite a smile, but something warmer than neutral. "Good name," he said. Eli left him to unpack. He walked back across the gravel toward the main house, and for reasons he didn't immediately examine, he stopped once at the fence post near the chicken coop and looked back at the bunkhouse, just for a moment. Just long enough to notice that through the window with the thin curtain, he could see Jesse sitting on the edge of the bunk, not unpacking yet, just sitting with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the floorboards, like he was saying something to himself that he needed to say before he could begin. Eli turned away and went inside. He told himself it was nothing. It was something. The first week passed the way the first week always passed on Redstone in early summer. There was too much to do and not enough hours in the day to do it, and the heat started early and stayed late, and by the time the sun dropped below the ridge line, every person on that ranch was too tired to be anything other than quiet and grateful and ready for sleep. Jesse moved into the rhythm of the work without complaint and without ceremony. He was in the stable before 5:30 every morning, and Eli knew this because he himself was usually awake by 4:45, unable to sleep past a certain hour, and he could hear the quiet sounds from across the yard, the soft thud of the stable door, the low murmur of someone speaking gently to a horse in the dark. On the third morning, Eli got up early enough to see Jesse through the stable door left slightly open, a lantern burning at the end of the aisle. He was brushing Ghost with long, slow strokes along the horse's neck, and he was talking to him. Not the kind of talking some people did, performative and self-conscious, as if aware of an audience. It was quiet talking, conversational, the kind of voice you used with someone you trusted. Eli stood just outside the door and listened without meaning to. "I know you don't remember me," Jesse was saying softly. "I know you've never seen me before, but I know you're kind. You're the kind that watches. You're the kind that waits to make up your mind." A pause and the sound of the brush moving in long strokes. "I respect that. I'm the same way." Ghost stamped one foot and turned his nose toward Jesse's shoulder. "Yeah," Jesse said. "Okay, maybe we'll be friends." Eli stepped back from the doorway before he was seen. He stood in the cool dark of the early morning and felt something strange move through him, not discomfort, but something like recognition. The feeling you got when you saw something in another person that mirrored something in yourself, something you hadn't named yet. He went inside and made the coffee too strong, and stood at the kitchen window and watched the stable door until the lantern light went out and the sky turned pink. By the end of the first week, a pattern had established itself without anyone planning it. At the end of the workday, after the evening feed and the equipment checks and the long process of closing everything down for the night, Eli would often find himself near the fence at the back of the main pasture. It was the one place on Redstone where you could see the whole spread, the rolling land going gold in the last light, the horses moving slow in the lower pasture, the ridgeline dark against the orange sky. It was the only place on the ranch where Eli allowed himself to stop. Jesse started appearing there too. It wasn't planned the first time. Jesse had been walking back from checking the east fence line and had simply stopped at the same spot, probably for the same reason Eli had always stopped there. It was the kind of view that made you pause whether you meant to or not. They had stood there in silence for almost 10 minutes before either of them spoke, and then it had only been Eli saying something about the forecast, and Jesse saying something back about the horses, and it hadn't needed to be more than that. But it happened again the next evening, and the one after that. By the fifth evening, it had become a thing neither of them acknowledged as a thing, which was perhaps why it continued without either of them overthinking it. They just ended up at the back fence as the sun went down, standing close enough that their arms were almost touching on the top rail, and they talked or they didn't talk, and either way it felt like something they needed. Eli learned things about Jesse in that slow, quiet way, not through direct questions but through what Jesse chose to offer. He had grown up in San Antonio, the second of 4 brothers. His mother was still there. His father had left when Jesse was 11, and Jesse talked about this once briefly, and then moved on quickly in a way that told Eli the wound was present but managed. He had spent 2 years working ranches across Texas and New Mexico, never staying more than a season anywhere. He didn't explain why. Jesse learned things about Eli too, that his father's illness was something that didn't have a good prognosis, and that this was something Eli carried without showing it most of the time. That Redstone had been in the Carter family for 3 generations, and the thought of losing it was something Eli thought about at 3 in the morning, with the kind of cold dread that no amount of work could fully banish. That Eli had given up a scholarship to an agricultural university in order to come home and run the ranch when his father's diagnosis came in, and that he had never once said that out loud to anyone, not even his father, before he said it to Jesse on a Thursday evening, with the sun going down and Ghost watching them from the middle of the pasture. Jesse was quiet after that for a long moment. "Do you regret it?" he asked. Eli thought about it honestly, which was something he rarely allowed himself to do. No, he said, but I think about the version of me that went to college sometimes. I wonder who he'd be. You'd still be you, Jesse said simply. The stuff that makes you you that doesn't change with geography. Eli turned to look at him. Jesse was still looking at the horizon, his jaw set in that steady, thoughtful way he had. That's either very wise or very naive, Eli said. Jesse glanced over with the ghost of a smile, that almost smile that Eli was beginning to recognize as a full smile by Jesse's scale. Can't it be both? Eli felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that he didn't immediately name. He looked back at the horizon and concentrated on the last edge of orange light above the ridge and told himself it was just the evening air. Part 2, the tension. 3 weeks in, and something had changed in the air of Redstone Ranch. It was subtle enough that no one could have pointed to it and named it. Carlos was oblivious, spending his evenings playing cards on his phone and listening to corridos at low volume. Big Roy noticed things but said less than anyone, and what he noticed he kept to himself. Eli's father, Earl Carter, came out to the porch some mornings wrapped in a blanket and watched the work from his chair, and he was perceptive in the way that people with a lot of time and limited energy become perceptive, closely, slowly, without announcement. Once, Earl called Eli over to refill his water glass, and when Eli came back out from the kitchen, Earl was watching Jesse work in the round pen with a young mare who'd been resistant to training. That boy can read a horse, Earl said. Yes, sir, Eli said. Earl looked at him with those old, careful eyes. He say much about himself. Not a lot. Earl nodded. The quiet ones usually have the most to say. They're just careful about who they say it to. Eli handed him the water glass and didn't answer, and Earl didn't push. But he watched his son walk back across the yard toward the stables, and he took a long sip of water and said nothing more. It was a Sunday afternoon when things first shifted into something undeniable. The heat had been brutal that week, the kind of Texas summer heat that pressed down on everything like a physical weight, that made the horses irritable and the flies unbearable and turned every simple task into an exercise in endurance. By mid-afternoon, the work was largely done, and Eli had given Carlos and Roy the afternoon off to go into town. He had meant to spend the time going over feed invoices at the kitchen table, but the house was stuffy, and the numbers on the pages kept blurring in the heat, and after an hour he gave up and came outside. He found Jesse in the shade on the far side of the stable, sitting against the wall with his knees up and a water bottle in his hand, his hat pushed back on his head, eyes closed. He had clearly been working hard, his shirt was dark with sweat, his forearms dusty, but he looked peaceful, the way he always looked when he was resting, like he knew how to be where he was. Eli should have turned around. He had a dozen things he could have been doing. Instead, he sat down against the wall beside Jesse, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and tipped his own hat back against the heat. Jesse opened one eye. Boss. Don't call me that, Eli said. Eli, Jesse corrected, and the way he said Eli's name, quietly, almost careful, like he was pronouncing something that mattered, did something to the back of Eli's neck. They sat in the shade for a while without talking, which was something they had both become comfortable enough with to do naturally. The sound of horses shifting in the stable, the buzz of insects in the long grass, somewhere far off, a hawk calling. Can I ask you something? Jesse said eventually. You're going to anyway, Eli said. Jesse smiled at that, a real one, which was different from his almost smile, and which Eli had only seen a handful of times, and every time felt disproportionately significant. What made you start running the ranch? Like, what was the actual moment you decided? Eli was quiet for a moment. I was in my second year. I got a call from my father's doctor. Not from my dad, from the doctor, which told me everything I needed to know about how bad it was, because my dad would rather walk into traffic than admit he couldn't handle something himself. He looked at his boots. I drove home that night. I didn't tell anyone at school. I just drove, got here around 3 in the morning. My dad was asleep, but the horses weren't fed. The fencing had a section down nobody had fixed, and the books were a mess. I just started working. I never went back. Jesse was quiet, listening. I told myself it was temporary, Eli continued, that I'd sort things out here and go back and finish the semester. But every time I got close to leaving, something else needed doing. And eventually I stopped pretending I was going to leave. He paused. I think the ranch needed me more than the university did. Do you think you needed the ranch? Jesse asked. The question caught Eli off guard. It was direct in a way that people who knew him well, or rather, the very few people who knew him at all, rarely managed. he turned to look at Jesse. Jesse was looking back at him, steady and open, not flinching from the eye contact the way most people did after a moment. "Yeah," Eli said quietly, "I think I did." Jesse nodded slowly, like that made sense to him, and then he didn't push further, didn't offer some tidy response or reflexive affirmation. He just accepted it, let it land. Eli realized in that moment that he couldn't remember the last time someone had asked him a question that went that far in, and then just left room for the answer to exist without trying to fix it or redirect it. He couldn't remember the last time someone had simply listened to him like what he said mattered. He looked away before Jesse could notice that his expression had softened in a way he wasn't prepared for. "What about you?" Eli said. "What made you leave Sundown Ranch?" Jesse took a long drink from his water bottle. The question hung between them, and Eli felt it, the slight hesitation, the particular quality of the silence that said this was a closed door, not just a slow one. "Something happened," Jesse said. "It made staying complicated." Eli waited. "I'd rather not get into it yet," Jesse said, and he looked at Eli when he said yet. It was a small word barely there, but it was a promise, or an offer, something. "Okay," Eli said simply. And then they just sat there in the shade, as the afternoon heat pressed down on the world outside, and the stable smelled of hay and warm wood and horse, and neither of them moved away from the nearly touching pressure of their shoulders against each other for a long, long time. The nights on Redstone were something Eli had always loved. Even at his most exhausted, even in the hardest stretches of winter or the brutal peak of summer, there was something about the Texas night sky from the back porch of the main house that reliably made everything feel more manageable. The stars were impossible out here, brilliant and thick, and so close that on clear nights you felt like you could reach up and drag your hand through them. He was sitting on the porch steps on a Wednesday night, 2 weeks into July, unable to sleep as usual, when he heard footsteps on the gravel. He didn't turn around immediately. He already knew who it was. Carlos walked heavy, Roy shuffled, but Jesse's footsteps had a particular, unhurried rhythm that Eli had apparently memorized without meaning to. Jesse came around the side of the house and stopped when he saw Eli. "Sorry, didn't think anyone would be up." "I'm always up," Eli said. "Sit down." Jesse sat on the step beside him. He had on a t-shirt and jeans, no hat, and his hair was slightly rumpled from lying down. He looked younger this way, without the hat and the work context around him, and Eli had to look away and focus on the stars. "Couldn't sleep either?" Eli asked. "I sleep fine usually," Jesse said. I like to be outside for a while, before sleep, I always have." He leaned back on his palms and looked up at the sky. "I grew up in the city, we didn't have this." "What do you mean?" "This," Jesse gestured upward, "this many stars, the dark. When I was a kid I'd never seen actual dark before. Light pollution everywhere. First time I slept outdoors on a real ranch, I woke up in the middle of the night and I thought something was wrong because it was so quiet and so dark, and then I looked up and," he paused. "I couldn't sleep at all that night. I just watched the sky until morning." Eli smiled without meaning to. "How old were you?" 16. I was working a summer job for a family friend's operation outside Buda. It was only 2 weeks, and I barely knew what I was doing, but I knew I'd found the thing." He said it with a simplicity and certainty that Eli recognized as the voice of someone who had made a real discovery about themselves and had never needed to revise it. "The thing," Eli repeated. "The thing you're meant to do." Jesse glanced at him. "Don't you have that? Don't you know that this is yours?" Eli looked out at the dark silhouette of the land, the pasture fence a pale line in the starlight, the shapes of the horses moving slow and dark against the grass. "Yeah," he said, "I do." "Then you're lucky," Jesse said quietly. "Not everybody finds it." There was something in his voice, not sadness exactly, but a kind of weight that suggested he was talking about more than horses and land. Eli wanted to ask, but he had learned Jesse's rhythms well enough by now to know that some things came with time, and pressure was the wrong approach. So he just sat beside him in the dark, and they watched the sky together, and at some point, their arms came to rest parallel on their knees, and they were close enough that Eli could feel the warmth of Jesse beside him like something real and solid. They sat there until past midnight, talking sometimes and not talking other times, and when Jesse finally said goodnight and walked back across the gravel, Eli stayed on the steps for another 20 minutes, looking at the stars and trying to understand the specific shape of the feeling in his chest, the ache of it, the warmth of it, the way it had no clean name. Part 3. Ghost. It was Ghost who brought things to a head. The grey horse had always been difficult. He'd come to Redstone 3 years ago as part of a lot of animals purchased from an estate sale after an old rancher in the next county had passed. Most of those animals had integrated easily into the ranch's routines. Ghost had not. He was not violent, he had never kicked or bitten in a truly dangerous way, but he had a deep, settled wariness toward people that no one on Redstone had fully managed to penetrate. He allowed himself to be handled, fed, shod, and ridden under duress, but he never stopped watching, never relaxed. It was as if he had decided at some point that trust was simply not worth the risk, and no amount of patience or good treatment had moved him from that position. Until Jesse. It happened gradually, then suddenly, the way most things did with horses. First, Jesse had gotten Ghost to eat from his hand by the end of week 1. Then by week 2, Ghost was coming to the fence when Jesse appeared in the morning rather than standing at the back of his paddock. By week 4, Jesse could stand with Ghost for 20 minutes, and the horse would rest his head on Jesse's shoulder and close his eyes, which Eli had never seen Ghost do with anyone, including Eli himself, who had been working with the horse for 3 years. Eli watched all of this from a careful distance, and felt something complicated that he refused to look at directly. The morning it came to a head was a Thursday, mid-July. Eli came to the stable at 6:15 to find Jesse in Ghost's stall, sitting on an overturned bucket in the corner, reading something on his phone while Ghost stood directly behind him with his chin resting on the top of Jesse's head. Ghost had his eyes half closed and was breathing slow and steady. Eli stopped in the doorway. Jesse looked up and saw Eli looking, and the moment they made eye contact, Jesse went still in a different way from his usual stillness. Something careful and watchful came into his expression, the way it sometimes did when he seemed to realize that he'd let himself be seen. "He started it," Jesse said. "I can see that," Eli said. He stepped into the stall, which made Ghost lift his head and ear toward Eli with his usual guarded attention. But he didn't step back or move away. He just watched Eli, which was already more than he usually allowed. Eli stood closer than Ghost normally let him, drawn forward by something he wasn't thinking about clearly. He reached up slowly and laid his palm flat against Ghost's neck, the way Jesse had shown him without demonstrating, just by example. He felt the muscle underneath, the warmth of the horse's coat in the morning light. Ghost didn't move. Eli exhaled. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. "You just have to let him decide," Jesse said from behind him, his voice low and close. "You've been trying to reassure him, but he doesn't need reassurance. He needs you to be real, to just be there without an agenda." Eli kept his hand on Ghost's neck and turned his head slightly. Jesse was standing now, just behind and to Eli's left, his shoulder almost level with Eli's. They were very close in the small space of the stall, and the morning light came in from the high window and lay across them both, and Ghost was warm under Eli's hand, and everything in that moment was very immediate and very specific. "Be there without an agenda," Eli repeated. Yeah, Jesse's voice was quiet but not cautious, just close. Eli turned fully and found Jesse looking at him with those dark, attentive eyes from a distance of maybe 18 inches, and something passed between them that had no language, only physics, like a current, like heat, like the particular quality of air before a storm. Jesse's jaw tightened slightly. His eyes moved, just briefly, and then moved back up. Eli stepped back, not abruptly, carefully, deliberately, the way you stepped back from something that had suddenly revealed its actual depth. "Good work with him," Eli said. His voice came out steady, which surprised him. Jesse nodded once. His expression was composed, but there was a tension at the corner of his mouth that hadn't been there before. Eli walked out of the stall and across the stable and out into the morning air, and stood by the water trough with his hands on the rim, and breathed the dry Texas heat, and told himself to get it together. He was not successful. There was a town event that weekend, a summer dance at the community center in Cresswell, which was the nearest town to Redstone, about 12 miles down the county road. It was the kind of event that Eli had attended every year of his life and never particularly looked forward to and never stayed at long. He went because Earl Carter had always gone, and because people expected to see the face of Redstone Ranch there, and because occasionally it was useful to make connections with neighbors about water rights or shared fencing. Carlos and Roy went together, driving Roy's truck with the radio playing too loud. Eli offered to drive separately. And Jesse said he'd ride with Eli. It was a simple logistical arrangement. It should not have felt like anything more than that. Eli drove. The county road ran straight through open country, amber in the late afternoon light, and Jesse sat in the passenger seat with his hat in his lap and his elbow on the window ledge, and his face turned slightly toward the passing landscape. He had put on a clean shirt, dark blue, collar open, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he smelled faintly of soap and something else Eli couldn't name, something warm and clean. You don't want to go, Jesse said. He was looking out the window. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Eli kept his eyes on the road. It's a small town thing, it can get claustrophobic. Meaning everyone knows your business. Meaning everyone thinks they know your business and then invents the rest, Eli said. It's different. Jesse made a sound that was almost a laugh. My mom's neighborhood was like that. Everybody knew everything, real or not. He paused. I kind of miss it, actually. Eli glanced at him briefly. You miss people knowing your business. I miss people caring enough to make up stories about you, Jesse said. Means you matter to someone, even if they get the details wrong. Eli didn't have an answer for that. He drove, and Jesse watched the land, and the radio played something low and country, and the truck cab was warm and too small and entirely too full of things neither of them were saying. The dance was exactly what Eli had expected, crowded, too warm, with music too loud and too many people wanting to ask him how Earl was doing with the tone of people who already knew the answer and just wanted the confirmation. He made the rounds, shook the right hands, deflected the questions about the ranch's finances with the vague optimism he'd perfected. He accepted a beer from Roy Garrett, who ran the next property west, and he looked for Jesse. Jesse was at the edge of the room, as Eli had expected, watching everything from a comfortable periphery. He was nursing a drink, and talking to a young man Eli didn't immediately recognize, someone who was laughing at something Jesse was saying, leaning in close with his shoulder angled toward Jesse in the universal physical vocabulary of interest. Eli looked away. He talked to Roy Garrett about rainfall. He talked to the Hendersons about their fence line. He accepted a second beer he didn't particularly want. He looked back across the room. The other man, Eli thought his name might be Davis, someone's nephew visiting from Austin, had moved closer. He was gesturing at something, and Jesse was listening, and Jesse was not leaning in, but he was not leaning away either, and he was wearing the small, polite version of his almost smile. Something tightened in Eli's chest that he identified, with a clarity that was almost clinical, as jealousy. He recognized it because it was not unfamiliar. He had felt versions of it before, not often, but enough. The sharp, unreasonable, entirely unearned constriction of the chest when someone who mattered to you gave their attention to someone else. He set down his second beer. He was not in the habit of acting on feelings he hadn't examined fully, and he was not going to start now. He crossed the room carefully, taking a route that brought him to the refreshment table first, buying himself 30 seconds to compose his expression into something unremarkable. When he reached Jesse, Davis was in the middle of a story about something in Austin that Eli didn't catch the beginning of. Jesse looked up when Eli arrived, and something in his expression changed, lit slightly, settled, in a way that Davis couldn't have missed if he was paying attention. There you are, Jesse said. It was not something a ranch employee usually said to their employer. It was something a person said to another specific person. There you are, Eli said back. Davis looked between them. He was perceptive enough to read the room, apparently, because he wrapped up his story quickly, made a pleasant exit, and drifted back toward the main floor. Jesse watched him go, then turned to Eli. You okay? I'm fine. Jesse looked at him for a moment. You don't look fine. Small town events, Eli said, like I said. Jesse accepted this with a slight nod, not challenging it, but his eyes stayed on Eli for a moment longer than necessary, reading something there that Eli wasn't sure he had succeeded in hiding. They stood together at the edge of the room for the rest of the evening, not talking much but close, their shoulders occasionally touching when people moved past them, and Eli concentrated on keeping his breathing even and not examining too closely why this, just standing beside Jesse in a crowded room, felt like the most present he had felt in months. On the drive home they were mostly quiet. The road was dark, the headlights cutting a path through the night. About halfway back, Jesse said without preamble, that guy was interested in you. Eli's hands tightened on the wheel. What? Davis, Jesse said. He wasn't talking to me. He was watching you. He was making conversation to get close enough to see how you'd react. Eli processed this. You could have mentioned that. I was curious about how you'd react, Jesse said simply. Eli didn't say anything. His heart was doing something unhelpful behind his ribs. How'd I do? He asked finally. He meant it to be light, deflecting. It didn't quite come out that way. Jesse turned to look at him from the passenger seat. The dashboard light was faint and blue-green, and Jesse's expression in that light was very open, very direct. You reacted, Jesse said. And then he turned back to the window, and they drove the rest of the way home, in a silence that hummed with everything neither of them was ready to say. Part 4. The Storm. August came in hard that year. The heat broke for a week in late July and everybody breathed for a minute, and then August arrived and reasserted itself in no uncertain terms. There were 2 stretches of days where the thermometer near the stable read 104 degrees by 2 in the afternoon, and the horses drank twice what they usually did and moved slow, and the whole ranch seemed to operate at a reduced pace, conserving itself. It was during this period that Eli made a mistake. Not a dramatic one, not one you could point to in the moment and identify as wrong. It was the kind of mistake that only becomes visible in retrospect, when you can trace back the thread to the exact point where the weaving went wrong. He pulled away from Jessie. It wasn't deliberate, at least not consciously, but after the drive home from the dance, after the thing Jessie had said, you reacted, and the way the air between them had changed into something charged and precarious, Eli had started to feel the weight of it. The specific kind of anxiety that came from realizing you were standing on the edge of something that, once you stepped off it, would change everything. And everything changing was a luxury he couldn't afford. The ranch needed him steady. His father needed him present. He did not have the bandwidth for whatever this was. So he was polite and professional, and he did not appear at the back fence in the evenings. He did not sit on the porch steps at night. He had the coffee made and poured before Jessie arrived at the stable in the mornings, and he left it on the fence post without comment, as he did for everyone, and he made sure to distribute his attention evenly across all 3 hands so that no one could read anything particular into anything. Jessie noticed within 2 days. He didn't say anything. Of course he didn't. That was not how Jessie operated. But Eli watched him in the way he'd learned to watch him, obliquely, from the periphery, and he could see the quality of Jessie's stillness change slightly. It became more deliberate, more contained, as if he was working harder to be as still as he was. By the end of the first week, Jessie had stopped appearing at the back fence entirely. By the middle of the second week, something easy and natural that had existed between them was gone from their interactions. Not replaced by coldness, Jessie was never cold, never difficult, never less than professional, but the warmth that had been there, that particular attentiveness, the ease of simply being in the same space, was muted, managed, kept behind a glass. And Eli, who had engineered this situation entirely by choice and understood exactly why he had done it, found it almost unbearable. He was fixing the gate hinge on the bunkhouse door, finally, weeks overdue, when Carlos came out for a water break, watching Eli work for a moment before settling on the nearby bench. "You know what Roy said," Carlos offered, with the specific tone of someone who has been waiting for the right moment. "Roy says a lot of things," Eli said. "Roy said the new guy's been asking around about whether there are other ranches hiring in the county," Carlos said. Flat, just the fact. Eli stopped with the screwdriver halfway through a turn. He made himself continue. Jessie asked that. "Roy heard him on the phone the other night. Couldn't make out who he was talking to, but that's what he heard." Carlos paused. "Roy could be wrong, he often is." "Thank you, Carlos," Eli said. Carlos shrugged and went back inside. Eli finished the hinge. He tested the door twice and found it swung clean and quiet, and he stood there for a moment holding the screwdriver and looking across the yard to the stable where he could hear Jessie working, and something tightened in his throat that had no business being there, and that he absolutely was not going to acknowledge. He went and found more things to fix. The storm came on a Friday. It had been building for 3 days in that particular way that summer storms built in that part of Texas, not with urgency but with quiet inevitability, the sky going stranger and stranger colors in the evenings, the air thickening, the animals becoming restless in ways that told you everything you needed to know. By Friday afternoon, the clouds were stacked in the west like a wall, and the weather radio was talking about a system moving through with possible hail and high winds, and Eli had everyone moving early to get the horses in and the equipment secured, and the vulnerable sections of fencing reinforced before nightfall. The storm hit at just after 9 in the evening. It came in fast and hard, the wind picking up within minutes from nothing to something fierce and sustained, the rain coming sideways, the lightning moving across the ridgeline in great sheets and forks that illuminated the whole landscape in staccato flashes. The power went out at 9:17, which Eli knew because that was when the clock on the kitchen microwave went dark, and the only light came from outside. Earl Carter, who had seen more storms on this land than he could count, was perfectly calm. He sat in his chair with a battery lantern and his book, and told Eli he was more useful outside than standing here watching the old man read. Eli took a flashlight and went out. The noise of the storm was significant, the wind against the buildings, the rain on every flat surface, a sound like continuous applause that obliterated everything else. He checked the west stable first, running across the yard with the rain hitting like thrown gravel, and found it secure. The horses were unsettled but contained, and Carlos was there already with a lantern, speaking quietly. He went to check the east paddock fence, which had been a concern, a section of post near the creek bed that had been softer than he liked when he'd pushed it last Tuesday. He found Jesse there first. Jesse was in the full force of the storm, knee-deep in the muddy ground along the fence line, using a fence post driver to reinforce the weak section before the creek rose further. His hat was gone. His shirt was soaked flat against his back. He was working with both hands in the streaming rain, and the flashlight he'd wedged in the ground beside him was tilting in the mud and casting a swinging, unreliable light across the scene. "Jesse!" Eli shouted over the wind. Jesse looked up. Even in the dark and the rain, even with the lightning flickering and the wind roaring, Eli could see that Jesse's expression was focused and calm, the way it was when he was working, the way it had nothing in common with panic. "Post was going," Jesse called back. "Needed another brace." Eli was at his side within seconds, taking the post driver, driving the reinforcement stake in while Jesse held the rails in place. They worked in the rain with the lightning walking across the hills behind them, communicating in gestures and short calls over the noise, moving the way people moved when they had worked together long enough to anticipate each other's actions. There was a moment where Jesse's hand closed over Eli's on the fence rail to guide the placement of the brace, and neither of them stopped moving or even glanced at each other, but Eli felt the contact like something electric that had nothing to do with the weather. 20 minutes later, the fence was braced and holding, and the creek had risen but was moving inside its banks, and the worst of the storm had crossed overhead and was moving south, leaving a steady hard rain in its wake. They stood at the fence line in the rain and the dark, breathing hard, and the relief of having secured the section was almost physical. Jesse pushed his soaked hair back from his face and looked at the brace. "That'll hold." "Yeah," Eli said. They were both soaked through completely. There was no point in running, they were well past wet. They stood there a moment in the rain, and the flashlight in the mud had finally given up and gone dark, so the only light was the distant lightning in the south and the faint glow from the main house's windows across the yard. "You didn't need to come out here," Jesse said. His voice was level, but something in it was different from his usual evenness. Something was present in it that was not usually there. "I had it." "I know you had it," Eli said. Jesse looked at him. In the dark and the rain, he looked stripped of something, not of composure, but of the careful management of composure. He looked the way a person looked when the conditions had simply become too extreme for the maintenance of their usual architecture. "Eli," Jesse said. "Jesse." "No," Jesse said. "Let me." He paused, rain running off his chin, his eyes steady. "Something happened between us 3-4 weeks ago, and then you decided something and you pulled back, and I let you because it wasn't my decision to make." He stopped. "But I need you to know that I noticed, and I need you to know what you pulling back felt like, because I don't think you know." Eli stood in the rain and said nothing. His chest felt very tight. "It felt like something I had was taken back," Jesse said. "Something I hadn't been asked to give, something I didn't even know I'd given until it was gone." His voice was steady, entirely controlled, but there was a rawness underneath it that Eli had never heard from him before, not in all their weeks of evening conversations and early mornings and shared silences. "And I'm not saying that to make you feel bad. I'm saying it because I'd rather tell you the truth than keep pretending I don't know what's happening." Eli found his voice. "What do you think is happening?" Jesse looked at him for a long moment. Rain, dark, the sound of water moving fast in the creek behind them. "I think," Jesse said carefully, "that you know exactly what's happening, and I think it scares you, and I think it scares me too for different reasons, and I think we've been circling it for weeks." He paused. "And I think standing in the rain in the middle of a storm is maybe the wrong place for this conversation, but I'm also done waiting for the right place." Eli said nothing, but he didn't move back. He didn't create distance. He stood in the rain 12 inches from Jesse and breathed and let the words land. "I heard you might be looking for other positions," Eli said finally. It came out quieter than he intended. Jesse's expression shifted. "You heard that?" "Roy heard you on the phone." Jesse exhaled. He looked down at the fence for a moment, then back up. "I was talking to me Prescott," he said. "She was offering me my position back at Sundown. She found out I was here, and she called me and asked me to come back." Eli felt the floor drop out of something in his chest. And I told her no," Jesse said. He met Eli's eyes directly. "I told her I'd found the thing." The silence between them was very full. Eli thought about what Jesse had said weeks ago, on the porch steps under the stars. Not everybody finds it. The quiet certainty with which Jesse had said it. The way he'd said it like he was talking about more than just the work. Jesse, his voice was rough. You don't have to say anything, Jesse said. I'm not asking you to say anything. I'm just telling you the truth because you gave me the truth about things that mattered, and it seemed right to give you the same back. He stepped back a single step. Let's go in, you'll catch cold. He turned and walked back toward the lights of the main house, his boots squelching through the mud, and after a moment Eli followed him through the rain with his heart beating in a regular, heavy rhythm and his mind very quiet and very loud at the same time. Part 5, The Silence and the Storm After the Storm. The next week was the hardest. They were both present, both working, both doing what needed to be done, but the conversation in the rain had changed the landscape between them in a way that couldn't be changed back. And navigating that new landscape while pretending there was no new landscape required a specific kind of continuous effort that was exhausting. Eli ran the work, Jesse did the work. They communicated clearly and professionally about everything that needed to be communicated about. At the back fence in the evenings, the space where they had once stood together was occupied only by the light and the sound of cattle. Eli went to sit with his father one evening, which he did regularly but less often than he should. Earl Carter was having a better day, more alert than usual, sitting up without the blanket, and he looked at his son with those careful old eyes and said, "You look like something's eating at you." "I'm fine, Dad." "You look like I looked when I was 28 and too stubborn to tell your mother I loved her," Earl said, "which cost me a year of my life I would have liked to have back." Eli looked at the floor. "I'm not asking," Earl said. "I'm just observing. You can do with it what you want." He picked up his book. "Your grandfather used to say that the land would wait, but people didn't." "Grandpa said a lot of things." "He was right more than he was wrong," Earl said and turned a page. Eli found Jesse at Ghost's paddock on Sunday evening. Jesse was standing at the rail, not doing anything, just watching the grey horse graze in the last light. Ghost was close to him, closer to the fence than he usually grazed, moving in a slow, contented circle with his nose down in the good grass. Eli came and stood beside Jesse at the fence. He stood there for a while without speaking. Jesse waited. "I need to tell you something," Eli said. Jesse went still in that way he had, that complete, attentive stillness that meant he was listening with his whole self. "When I was 19, Eli started and then stopped. He looked at the horse for a moment. "When I was 19, I had a friendship with someone, a guy I'd grown up with, known since grade school. And things changed between us the way things changed, and I didn't know what to do with it, and I handled it badly, and I lost the friendship entirely. And he stopped again. It was the thing I regretted most for a long time, the way I handled it." Jesse was quiet. "And I told myself after that I wouldn't put myself in a position where I'd have to handle something like that badly again," Eli continued. "I thought if you don't let it start, you don't have to worry about the ending." He exhaled. "That's why I pulled back, not because of you, because of me." Jesse turned to look at him. His expression was careful and open at the same time. "What happened to your friend?" Jesse asked. "We tried to talk about it once much later, but it was too late by then. He'd moved away, built his life somewhere else." Eli looked at the fence. "I think if I'd been honest earlier, things would have been different, but I was afraid of what honest meant, afraid of what it made me, afraid of all of it." Jesse was silent for a long moment. "And now?" he asked quietly. Eli turned to face him fully. The evening light was horizontal and golden, and it fell across Jesse's face, and across the grey horse behind him, and across the whole wide land. And Eli had the specific thought that this was the most beautiful and the most terrifying moment of his adult life, and that both of those things were real and neither of them cancelled the other out. "Now I'm still afraid," Eli said honestly, "but I'm more afraid of what it would be like if you left and I'd never said anything." Jesse held his gaze. He was very still. "I'm not going anywhere," Jesse said. "I heard you tell me no," Eli said, "but the summer ends. Your contract ends in 6 weeks. That was always the arrangement." "I know what the arrangement was," Jesse said. He stepped slightly away from the fence, turning to face Eli more fully, and Eli's heart was doing something complicated and sustained. "I'm telling you what I want the arrangement to be." Eli looked at him. "Which is?" Jesse took a breath, and he said in that quiet, level, absolutely certain voice that he used for things he had thought about carefully, "I want to stay. I want to keep working this land. I want to keep watching Ghost figure out that people aren't all terrible." He paused. I want to keep standing at the back fence in the evenings with you. I want more of whatever those conversations were. He stopped. What? Eli said. I want you to stop being afraid of this, Jessie said quietly, because what this is, what I feel when I'm around you, that's not something I want to handle badly, that's something I want to get right. The sun was nearly at the ridge now, the sky going deep orange and the first star appearing in the east. Ghost had lifted his head and was watching them both with those grey, serious eyes. Eli took one step toward Jessie, then another. Jessie didn't move back, he didn't move forward. He just waited in that particular Jessie way, letting things arrive at their own time, steady and open and entirely present. Eli reached up and placed his hand on Jessie's jaw, carefully, like something valuable, and the warmth of his skin was very real and very specific, and Jessie's breath came out slow. I don't know what I'm doing, Eli said. Yes, you do, Jessie said. And Eli, for the first time in a long time, allowed himself to do the thing he knew how to do and had been afraid to do, and Jessie, who had been patient as the land itself, and as steady as anything Eli had ever known, leaned into it slightly, and the world went very quiet and very warm and very full. Fade to black. Part 6, After. The morning after was ordinary. That was the first thing Eli noticed. The sun came up at the same time, it always did, grey and early, and the horses needed feeding and the buckets needed filling, and the day's work needed doing. He made the coffee too strong as usual, and stood at the kitchen window as usual, and watched the stable door. Jessie came out at 5:22 as usual. He looked up at the main house, saw Eli's shape in the window and lifted one hand. Simple, easy. Something in Eli's chest unclenched. He took 2 mugs of coffee across the yard. They sat on the fence at the edge of the main paddock and drank coffee in the early light, and Ghost came over immediately when he saw Jessie, pushing his nose against his shoulder, and Jessie rubbed the horse's forehead with his knuckles and talked to him quietly. He's going to be insufferable, Eli said. He thinks you hung the moon. I did hang the moon, Jessie said. I just let him figure it out himself. Eli looked at him sideways. Jessie was watching Ghost with that clear, warm expression, the hat pushed back, the coffee mug warm in both hands, and the light was coming up across the land in long golden bars, and the ranch was waking up around them with all its particular sounds. The birds, the horses, the creak of the stable, Carlos's radio playing something through the thin wall. Jessie, Eli said. Eli, Jessie said. I want you to stay, Eli said. Permanently, full time. I'll work out the formal arrangement with my father, but I want you to stay. Jessie was quiet for a moment. He took a long drink of his coffee. I was wondering when you'd get around to asking, he said. I just decided this morning. You decided this morning, Jessie agreed, but you knew last month. Eli thought about that. Yeah, I knew last month. Jessie nodded slowly, looking at the land. Okay, he said, I'll stay. There was nothing more complicated than that in the end. It was simple the way real things were simple, stripped of all the unnecessary parts, arrived at through work and waiting and truth-telling, available to anyone who had the patience for it. The weeks that followed were different from everything before and exactly the same as everything before, simultaneously. The work was the same. The land was the same. The horses and the fence lines and the morning feed and the long evening light were all exactly what they had always been. But Eli walked through all of it differently. He noticed it first in small ways. He was more present at the dinner table with his father, less likely to eat in 3 minutes flat and excuse himself back to the work. He laughed more easily. He noticed the sky more, the particular way the clouds stacked in the late afternoon, the specific blue that happened for about 20 minutes after sunset. He noticed the land that had always been his in a way that felt somehow new, as if someone had cleaned the glass through which he viewed it. You seem better, Earl said one morning from his porch chair, watching Eli coming back from the stable. I feel better, Eli said, which was true and was also the most he had said about his own inner life to another person in a long time. Earl nodded. Good, he said. The land can feel it when the person running it is carrying too much. The horses can too. He went back to his book. Jessie still working out well. He's the best hand I've ever had, Eli said. Earl turned a page. I know, he said. Jessie, for his part, seemed to expand. It was the right word, expand, as if the decision to stay had opened something up in him, removed some structural tension that had been present since the day he arrived. He smiled more, not more often particularly, but more completely, fuller versions of that smile that Eli had been cataloguing since the beginning. he talked more easily with Carlos and Roy. He spent long hours with Ghost and the mare who'd been resistant, and both animals were transformed in ways that people who saw them regularly had to double-take to believe. He told Eli about me Prescott one evening at the back fence, what had happened at Sundown Ranch, a situation, a person that had made things complicated, that had tested his sense of himself and his sense of what he wanted, that had sent him away with his duffel bag and one clear decision, to find a place that felt right and to be honest there. Was it hard, Eli asked, being honest there at the beginning? Hardest thing I ever did, Jesse said. Worth it. Eli looked at the last light on the ridge. I've been thinking about that, about how you were honest from the beginning and I wasn't. You were, Jesse said, in your way. At the back fence, you told me things you hadn't told anyone. That counts. I told you about the ranch, not about, Eli gestured vaguely. Jesse's mouth curved. Not everything needs words. I think you knew I knew. That's its own kind of honesty. Eli shook his head slowly. You're annoyingly wise, do you know that? My mother would find that hilarious, Jesse said. She'd say I was just a slow learner who finally paid attention. Tell me about her, Eli said. And Jesse talked. He talked about his mother, Maria Navarro, small and fierce and funny, who still lived in the same house in San Antonio, where she'd raised 4 boys with what Jesse called formidable good humor, who worked 2 jobs and made the best tamales in 3 zip codes, and who had, when Jesse had come home one Thanksgiving at 18 and finally said out loud the thing he'd been carrying since he was 14, held his face in both hands and said, Mijo, I know and I love you, and now let's eat. Eli listened to all of this and felt something very warm and very thorough move through him. Not just love, that word was there, yes, present and real and still being fully recognized, but something broader. Gratitude, for Jesse's mother who had held his face and said I know, for this land which had waited for him, for the summer and the storm and Ghost and the back fence and all the particular ordinary elements of a life that had conspired to bring him to this moment. She sounds incredible, Eli said. She is, Jesse said, you'll like her. The easy certainty of it, you'll like her, as if the meeting was simply a question of when, settled in Eli's chest like something that had always been there, only now named. Yeah, Eli said, I think I will. Part 7. What changed? September arrived the way September always did in that part of Texas, the heat stepping back just slightly, the light going different, the mornings developing a sharpness that August didn't have. The horses noticed it first, as they noticed everything first, a new energy in their movement, a lift in the step that made the work easier and the riding something worth doing again. Eli's father had a difficult stretch in September, a week where the illness made itself known more loudly than usual, where the doctor came twice, and the house was quieter in a way that wasn't peaceful but watchful. Eli was up early and late, doing the ranch work and the household work and the caretaking work that all needed doing, and he was exhausted in a way that went down to the bone. Jesse didn't try to fix it. He didn't offer solutions or optimistic reframes or any of the well-meaning things that people sometimes offered in the face of grief-adjacent situations that they didn't know how to sit with. He just showed up. He left coffee on the kitchen porch in the mornings before Eli was up. He took on extra tasks without being asked, without making them visible in a way that would require acknowledgement, just quietly absorbing more of the load. And in the evenings, when Eli came to the back fence, Jesse was there, and they stood together in the cooling air and said whatever needed saying or said nothing at all. One night Eli sat down in the dirt at the base of the fence post, just sat down, suddenly and completely, like a phone whose battery had dropped to 0. Jesse sat down beside him without hesitation, their backs against the post, looking out at the dark shapes of the horses in the pasture. He's not going to get better, Eli said. It was the first time he had said it directly. He had thought it 1,000 times, had lived in the knowledge of it for 2 years, but saying it to another person was a different thing entirely. It remade the knowledge, made it real in a new dimension. Jesse said nothing for a moment, then, I know. This land is going to be mine entirely, Eli said. All of it, the responsibility of it, the weight of it. He paused. I've been preparing for that for years and I still can't look at it directly. You don't have to look at it directly yet, Jesse said. It's not here yet. It will be. Yeah, Jesse said, it will be, and when it is, you'll handle it the way you handle everything. He paused, not alone. Eli turned his head and looked at Jesse in the dark. Jesse was looking straight ahead, jaw set, voice steady. Not alone, Eli repeated. Not alone, Jesse confirmed, simply, finitely. Eli leaned his head back against the fence post and looked up at the stars, which were as impossibly thick and brilliant as they had ever been, and he breathed for a while, and the night sounds of the ranch went on around them, and Jesse was warm and solid beside him, and the land lay out in all directions in the dark, patient as it had always been, waiting as it had always waited. Earl Carter had a better week the following week. He came out to the porch 3 mornings in a row, and on the Thursday of that week he called Jesse over, and Jesse came and sat in the empty chair beside him, and they talked for almost an hour. Eli watched from a distance, unable to hear what was being said, observing only the quality of the conversation, Earl leaning forward at one point, animated, which he hadn't been in weeks. Jesse listening with that full, focused attention he brought to everything. At one point both of them laughing at something, a real laugh, Earl's chest moving with it. When Jesse came back across the yard, Eli met him at the stable door. "What did he say?" Eli asked. Jesse smiled, the full one. "He told me about the year he bought Redstone. He was 24. He had almost nothing, just a loan and a partner he ended up buying out, and he stood on this land for the first time and felt it." He paused. "He said the land chose him. He said he thinks the land chose you too, and that the land was smarter than people gave it credit for." Eli looked over at his father, who was back to his book, the morning light on his face. "Did he say anything else?" Eli asked. Jesse met his eyes. Something warm moved in his expression. "He said he was glad you weren't alone." Eli exhaled. He looked at the ground for a moment, then back up at Jesse. "My father," he said, "has always had impeccable timing." Jesse laughed, actually laughed, clear and real, and the sound of it across the dusty yard on that September morning was one of the best sounds Eli had ever heard. Part 8: The Season Turning. October came in gold and amber and wide blue sky. The ranch in autumn was its best self, the light softer, the air clean and cool in the mornings, the land losing the defensive tension of summer heat and settling into something more open and generous. The horses were at their most beautiful in this season, their coats deepening with the change of temperature, their movement effortless in the cooler air. Eli and Jesse settled into the rhythms of the ranch as two people settled in, which was differently from one person alone. There was a sharing of effort that went beyond logistics, a second pair of eyes on everything, a second mind in the evenings working through the problems of fence lines and feed costs and the mare's slow progress. There was, Eli found, a particular quality to work done alongside someone who understood it, someone who cared about the outcome for its own sake, not for the wage, someone who moved through the land the way he himself moved through it, with attention and investment. Jesse was learning Redstone deeply. He learned its particular characters, the places where the drainage went wrong in heavy rain. The fence section on the north property line that needed inspection every 6 weeks without fail, which horses paired well in the pasture and which needed space. He asked questions that showed he was thinking long-term, not just through the next task. "You're thinking about next spring's rotation," Eli said one evening, watching Jesse sketch something in the small notebook he carried. "The west pasture's been overgrazed," Jesse said. "Not badly, but enough. If we shift the horses to the east rotation by November and give the west 6 months, it'll come back strong." Eli leaned over his shoulder to see the rough diagram. Jesse's hand was braced on the table edge close to Eli's, and Eli was very aware of that proximity in the specific, particular way he was always aware of proximity with Jesse, not anxiously, not anymore, but with a clear, steady recognition. "That's what my grandfather did," Eli said, "before the drought years. He rotated the west pasture regularly." Jesse looked up from the notebook. "You never mentioned that." "I never connected it to what you were sketching until just now." He straightened. "It's the right call. Let's plan it out." They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours with the ranch maps and the forage records in Jesse's notebook, planning the rotation. Earl Carter drifted through once, looked at the spread of papers, made a sound of approval, and drifted back out. Carlos poked his head in for something and saw the two of them bent over the maps shoulder to shoulder and retreated without whatever he'd come for, clearly recognizing that the room was occupied by something that did not need interrupting. When they were finished, the plan was good. Eli could see it working, could see the logic of it. He folded the maps and put them in the proper drawer, and Jesse closed his notebook, and they sat for a moment in the good silence of work well done. "Thank you," Eli said. Jesse looked at him, mild and direct, for a land rotation plan. "For everything," Eli said, which was not a small word, and Jesse received it without deflecting. "Yeah," Jesse said, "same." The first real frost came the second week of October, which was early for that part of Texas. Eli found it when he went out at 5 in the morning, the grass silver-white in the flashlight's beam, the water troughs with thin ice at the edges that cracked when he pressed it with his thumb. Jesse was already at the stable. He had put extra bedding in the stalls the night before, anticipating. The horses were content and warm. Ghost came to his name when Jesse said it quietly in the dark. Eli stood in the stable door and watched the early work, the lamplight on Jesse's hands, the breath visible in the cold air, the particular calm of the place. He thought about something Carlos had said to him, early in the summer, half joking, the new guy's going to be trouble. He was right, just not the kind of trouble he'd meant. Jesse turned from the stall and saw Eli in the door. He raised an eyebrow. You going to stand there or help? I was appreciating the view, Eli said. Jesse's expression did the thing it did, warming specifically, directionally, with that quality of light that Eli had spent months trying not to look for, and had long since stopped pretending he wasn't looking for. He shook his head slightly. Appreciating the view, he repeated. He tossed Eli a feed bucket. Come appreciate it while you work. Eli caught it and came inside. Part 9. What was said and what was understood. There was a Sunday in late October that was very clear and very still. The previous week had been hard, a difficult stretch for Earl, more doctor's visits, a longer and more specific conversation about care arrangements and what the coming months would look like. Eli had moved through it with his usual steady exterior and had felt the weight of it in every quiet moment. He had talked to Jesse about it on the phone one night. Jesse was doing the overnight check on the east fence after a coyote had been sighted near the property, and they had talked for 2 hours, Eli sitting on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinet and the phone warm against his ear, talking through things he had never said out loud to anyone. On that Sunday morning, he came outside to find Jesse in the round pen with the resistant mare, and something had changed. The mare was circling him willingly, following his movement, her head low and her eyes soft. Jesse stood in the center of the pen and moved slowly, and the mare moved with him like a shadow, like a partner, completely attentive to his slightest shift. Eli leaned on the round pen fence and watched. After 15 minutes, Jesse stilled himself completely, and the mare walked to him and put her forehead against his chest and stood there. Jesse looked up and found Eli watching. Something in his face was unguarded in a way that only happened when something very significant had just occurred, not triumph, but something deeper and quieter, the feeling of a thing earned. Eli smiled, not because something was funny, but because some expressions were the only appropriate response to certain moments. Jesse came to the fence when the mare was settled back in her stall. She's ready, he said. I can see that, Eli said. He looked at Jesse for a moment. The morning light, the hay in his hair, the specific shape of him, familiar now in the way that very few things in Eli's life were familiar, the way Redstone itself was familiar, deeply known, deeply felt, irreplaceable. I want to tell you something, Eli said. Jesse leaned on the fence across from him, listening. I've been working this land since I was a child, Eli said, and I've had good hands here, and I've had people I respected, and I've had people I liked working alongside. He paused, but I have never had someone who made the work feel the way it feels with you here. He looked at Jesse directly. I don't just mean useful, I mean full, like the whole thing is complete in a way it wasn't before. Jesse was quiet. And I know that's a strange thing to say, Eli continued, and I'm still not the best at saying these things, but I've been trying to be better at being honest when it matters. He held Jesse's gaze, and this matters. Jesse looked at him for a long moment, and then he said with that particular quiet certainty that was entirely, completely Jesse, I found the thing. I told you that early on. I meant the land, I meant the horses. He paused. I also meant you. The morning around them was very still, the blue sky absolutely clear, Ghost watching from his paddock with those wise, patient eyes. Eli stepped around the fence post and Jesse turned to face him, and they stood close together in the cool October light, and Eli put his hand against Jesse's face again, the same gesture as the first time, careful, present, and Jesse turned his face slightly into that contact the way Ghost turned his face toward Jesse's hand, and everything was very warm and very real. We're going to be okay, Eli said. He wasn't sure if he meant the two of them, or the ranch, or his father, or all of it. He thought maybe all of it. Yeah, Jesse said, we are. Part 10, The Year Turns. Winter came to Redstone. It was never a dramatic winter in that part of Texas, not the snow-heavy winters of further north, but it had its own character. Cold mornings with ice on the water lines that needed breaking, the horses thickening into their winter coats, the land going from gold to grey to a particular spare beauty that Eli had always loved, but rarely let himself sit with. He let himself sit with it this year. He and Jesse worked the winter rotation through November and December, and the west pasture rested as planned, and by the time January's thin sun hit it, you could already see the difference in the grass, the tentative green of recovery beginning, slow and real. Jesse had been right. The land was responding. Earl Carter was stabilized, which was not the same as improved, but was the best they could hope for. And his good days were real good days, days where he sat at the kitchen table and ate the whole meal, and talked about what the spring rotation should look like and asked Jesse's opinion on the quarter horses, with the thoughtful, specific engagement of a man who still had things he cared deeply about. On Christmas Eve, Eli called his mother. She had left Redstone when Eli was 17, remarried, lived now in a house in New Mexico that Eli visited once a year. The call was warm and pleasant and not fully honest, as their calls sometimes weren't, but when she asked how things were going, Eli said, "Good, better than good," and he meant it in a way he hadn't been able to mean it for a long time. He and Jesse drove into Cresswell on Christmas morning to pick up supplies and a few things Earl had asked for. The town was quiet and cold and lovely in the particular way of small Texas towns in winter, with decorated storefronts and a pine wreath on the post office door. They walked the 2 blocks of the main street together, their breath visible in the cold air, their shoulders touching naturally as they walked. In the small hardware store, Mr. Billings at the counter, who had known Eli since birth, looked at them both with the particular look of a man who had been watching the story develop and had a conclusion, and said simply, "Good to see you looking well, Eli. You bring Jesse by again soon." Eli said he would. Jesse, who had been in Cresswell only twice before, glanced at Eli as they left the store. "He called me by name," Jesse said. "Small town," Eli said, "everyone knows." Jesse considered this. "Is that okay with you?" Eli looked at him, the cold air, the clear sky, Jesse's face, which he had been reading now for months and knew better than any landscape. "Yeah," Eli said, "it is." February brought the first planning meetings for the year's operations, and Jesse sat at those meetings at the kitchen table with Earl and Eli, his notebook open, his voice steady and clear when he spoke, and Earl treated him as he had treated Eli's grandfather's old partner decades ago, as someone with standing in the conversation, someone whose opinion on the land had earned its weight. Carlos and Roy renewed their contracts without being asked. Big Roy, who said less than anyone, said to Eli one morning near the end of February, "Good operation this year." He meant it as the highest compliment available. March came in warm, a suggestion of spring in the evening air, the first green coming up in the west pasture ahead of schedule, which made Jesse quietly and completely delighted. He stood at the west fence and looked at the pasture with that clear, satisfied expression of someone who had made a right call and was watching it prove itself. Eli stood beside him. "You knew this would happen," Eli said. "I thought this would happen," Jesse said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Yes, knowing would have been arrogance, thinking was just paying attention. Eli shook his head. "You're going to be insufferable when all your plans work out this spring." "Probably," Jesse agreed cheerfully. Ghost appeared at the fence beside them, pushing his nose between the rails to reach the new green grass. "He thinks it's for him," Jesse said. "Everything is for him as far as he's concerned," Eli said. Jesse reached down and rubbed Ghost's nose, and Ghost made a low, contented sound and pushed back into the touch, and the evening light was gold across the land, and the west pasture was green and recovering, and all of Redstone lay around them in all its dimensions, the weight and beauty and history of it, the work of it, the life of it. Jesse turned to look at Eli. He was close enough that the warmth of him was perceptible in the cool evening air. "I want to tell you something," Jesse said, mirroring Eli's words from October, consciously, with a slight curve at the corner of his mouth. "Shoot," Eli said. Jesse looked at him with those clear, dark, entirely present eyes. "I don't want to be anywhere else," he said. "Not anywhere in the world. This is the place. This is the work. This is the—" He stopped. The curve at the corner of his mouth deepened into the full smile, the real one. "This is everything." Eli looked at him, at the land, Ghost with his nose in the new spring grass, at the wide sky going orange and violet over the ridge. "Yeah," Eli said. He reached over and took Jesse's hand where it rested on the fence rail. Easy, natural, present, and Jesse's fingers closed around his without any hesitation at all, and they stood together at the fence as the evening came in and the first stars appeared, and the horses moved slow and dark across the pasture below. Ghost lifted his head and looked at them both with those serious, ancient eyes that had watched everything from the beginning. And he went back to his grass. Epilogue: What the land remembers. There are things that Redstone Ranch will carry forward. The story of Earl Carter, who bought the land at 24 with almost nothing and built it into something that outlasted the hardest years. The story of Eli, who gave up a different life to come back to this one and found that the different life was smaller than what he came home to. The story of a grey horse named Ghost who decided, against his better judgment, that people were worth the risk. And the story of a summer morning in June, when a young man with a leather duffel bag stood in the gravel driveway and went absolutely still, looking out at the open land the way a person looked at something they had been searching for. The land carries these things forward. The people on it keep working, keep fixing the fence lines and rotating the pastures and feeding the horses at 5:30 in the morning while the sky is still grey and the stars are still out. They keep standing at the back fence in the evenings. They keep having conversations that go as far down as conversations can go, and they keep choosing honesty over safety, which is not always easy and is always, always worth it. This is what Redstone is. This is what it will continue to be. The work and the land and the light and the life of it, ordinary and extraordinary at once, the way all real things are. And the grey horse in the east paddock, watching everything with those patient, knowing eyes, deciding finally and completely that some people are worth keeping close. End.
If you watched all the way here, you already know you felt something different about this story. Something about Eli standing still for the first time in years. Something about Jesse choosing honesty over safety. Something about a grey horse deciding a stranger was worth trusting. That's what a real slow burn story does. It does not rush. It earns it. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now. It means more than you know. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Romantic, cinematic, emotionally real with characters you actually care about by the end. And drop a comment below telling me which moment hit you the hardest. Was it the storm, the back fence, Ghost putting his nose against Jess's chest, the Christmas morning in the Crosswell? I read every single one. Thanks for watching and keep watching.